Hello and welcome to Chat DPS. This is a special edition. This week, Robert and I are joined by an expert in crisis management, Jonathan Hemus. Jonathan is the managing director of Insignia, a very highly regarded organization who operate in the UK. So we're going to get some interesting perspectives today. Obviously, Robert's going to be giving his legal perspective, and Jonathan will be able to sort of give us some guidance around crisis management and what's really best practice around that. So we're going to sort of like spend today looking at three key things that happened during 2024. The end of 2023 really is one of them, which was the Transport for London arrangement. We're going to talk about Medis Secure, which was a problem that happened here in Australia, and then there's a global event which was of course CrowdStrike. So on the basis of let's start global first of all, shall we? Let's have a delve into the CrowdStrike issue, and I'd like to sort of like hear first of all, Robert, your perspectives on the legal perspectives around CrowdStrike. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think CrowdStrike probably touched all of us in some way or another. So even if we weren't directly impacted, so it seemed to impact pretty much all Microsoft machines around the world. I think it started in Australia first. I think that was quite interesting. Was we started to see failures in Australia, and then as basically it was related to some software that was pushed out, essentially an update. So CrowdStrike is an endpoint detection system, and sits on machines, sits on the kernel of machines, particularly with Microsoft products. And it would seem that an update to its endpoint detection was pushed out on a Friday. They often say don't push things out on a Friday, and it would appear, and I don't think it's clear, but it would appear that update wasn't tested properly, and when it pushed out, and it was pushed out globally, and I think that's why we saw this kind of domino effect, because as time zones moved on, you saw each country kind of go down after Australia did, and yeah, you got the blue screen of death for quite a lot of those who have Microsoft machines, and then it spread to things like FPOS devices in supermarkets, in petrol stations, and everyone wasn't able to do things for quite some time until CrowdStrike identified the issue, and they published a fix for it, which I think in most cases has been manually put out. So I think that's the general issue. But yeah, a huge impact. I think estimates are it cost at least $1 billion globally, probably more.
Billion. A
And that's
billion
just a billion. Yeah, and that's just the estimate.
with a
Um,
birth.
with a B, with a B. I think for a couple of, I guess, a couple of legal things to sort of talk about. One is, okay, so if I'm affected by this, what do I do? So in terms of making a claim, if you look at the terms and conditions you would have with CrowdStrike, you will see that they've locked down liability pretty tightly, and you would only be able to claim probably the most you'd be able to claim is the annual fees that you would pay CrowdStrike. So, whether that's thousands or tens of thousands, it probably wouldn't be anywhere near the loss you might suffer as an organization. So that's the first issue, is the liability issue. Most organizations are not able to negotiate terms and conditions with a CrowdStrike or a Microsoft or whoever it might be. You've just got to take what you can get. And the next point is, well, okay, if you wanted to bring a claim, well, if you look at the terms and conditions again, you'd actually have to bring that claim in New York against CrowdStrike. And the arbitration, so if it gets sent to arbitration is in Singapore. So if you're let's say you're an individual or a small to medium enterprise, you're really not going to bring a claim against CrowdStrike, even if you've got the right to claim loss. And there are some Australian consumer law protections around that, actually bringing that claim would be hugely challenging. So really, I think if you're thinking about how would I mitigate against that particular loss if this was to occur again, whether it's CrowdStrike or whether it was some other software cybersecurity supplier, what can you do? Well, insurance is one thing that's always something you can default to, and it might be that your typical business interruption insurance would not actually respond to this kind of event because those policies tend to look for physical damage causing loss as opposed to cyber damage, as it were. So you probably have to look to a cyber insurance policy, and but so that might be something you would have to look into if you didn't have that already as a mitigation. The other thing to consider is potentially outsourcing. So there are risks around this, but if you can shift that liability onto a third party, a local third party, and you suffer loss, and if you've set up your contract in a way that allows you to claim more than you would be able to do under the terms and conditions of CrowdStrike, then you've protected yourselves a little bit more than you would do if you were dealing directly with a CrowdStrike. However, as we know, if you're then dealing with a managed service provider, then that comes with its own risks because you need to ensure that managed service provider has adequate controls, adequate security. It may be that you're shifting one liability, but then you're opening yourselves up to other liabilities. And so you have to make that determination about whether that's the right path to take. So I guess those are probably a couple of the key points I'd want to bring up in relation to that one.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I mean, from a crisis management perspective, I mean, this was a disaster, right? I mean, it was fairly substantial. Pretty much everybody around the world was affected by this. What advice can you give people around something like this happening again in the future? I mean, or did you have any experience of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, two or three key learnings coming out of this. I think the first one is that CrowdStrike was and still is a hugely successful organization, a big organization, and also one that had built up a fantastic reputation as one of the preeminent players in this part of the market. And I guess the reason I mention that is this just goes to show that even the biggest and the best and the most admired can be brought to its knees via either a cyber attack or in this case, not a cyber attack, but an update that went wrong. So this is a real warning against complacency, a warning against it can't happen to us, a warning against we're too big to fail. This can happen to anyone. The other thing kind of linked with that is when I think about crisis management more broadly, some of the most damaging crises are those that cut right across the very essence of who you are or what you do. So for CrowdStrike, who exist to protect people from outages as a result of cyber issues, for them to actually cause their customers to be unable to transact or do business, it's particularly damaging. So I would say to your viewers and listeners, think about what we are here to do. Think about what we have promised to our customers, and really make sure you have particularly protected those things. And the third thing I'd say is, as a crisis management consultancy, over the last 16 years since we've existed, we've run literally hundreds of scenario-based exercises and simulations to get organizations ready to respond to the worst days of their lives. And 5 or 10 years ago, the types of scenarios we were focusing on were very broad spread. It could be a faulty product, it could be an environmental incident, it could be a major accident at a factory. About 5 years ago, it changed so that every other exercise was based on a cyber incident of some kind. And so 1 in every 2 exercises was based on a cyber incident. What's interesting now, literally over the last 12 months, is there is still a that tech focus. There's 50% focused on technology crises, but most of those right now are not about cyber attacks, but they are about, or they may be about cyber attacks, but they're about vulnerability caused by third parties. And that's all about CrowdStrike. The number of exercises we've run over the last 6 to 12 months that are about a major supplier causing our client to potentially have an issue, which is a new thing. So the lesson there is be very aware of the vulnerabilities that your suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers present. Don't just focus on your own environment. It's what's going on outside your own perimeter as well as inside.
Yeah, that's certainly from my perspective. I thought it was the it changed the landscape completely because who on earth? I mean, it's always been about who'd been attacked from a ransomware
Yeah.
perspective, or who. Whereas now this was just something completely different, right? So the ability for that has changed.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is a substantial change, as you say, in the marketplace.
I
Robert,
suppose
did you have
if
any?
I can, well, I was going to jump in if you don't, I was going to say one of the things that also I was thinking about was, I mean, this goes to critical infrastructure, and it goes to critical infrastructure on a national level, and I'm wondering, Jonathan, if that's something that you're aware of in terms of, has the British government got involved in this at all? Are they looking at this from a national level? Because like you say, this crossed sectors and it brought down various critical infrastructure sectors.
Yeah.
Are you aware of exercises being run at that kind of national level in order to kind of maintain critical core functions when one of these sort of outages happens?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that the government and those in the know fear the most, and this would probably be, it could be accidental, but also, with the world at the moment, it could be a targeted geopolitical attack to bring, for example, the power down across all of a country or part of a country. And I think, yeah, that critical national infrastructure is very much a focus. The UK government has just launched a new national resilience department. That's literally in the last 6 months, and there is growing awareness and growing concern about the vulnerability to critical national infrastructure being taken down. So yes, we are definitely seeing that.
Yeah, same thing in Australia. Same thing in Australia. So we've had several updates to the security of critical infrastructure legislation in Australia, and cyber resilience at that kind of national level has been spoken about for quite some time. I'm not aware what the government's response was to CrowdStrike, but I'm sure they would be looking at that. I'm sure they would be trying to do simulations of similar exercises across that kind of national level as well here.
Yeah. So guys, I want to move on. The next one, I mean, going from $1 billion sort of problem to a 30 million pound problem. So it's a 30 million pounds, so about 60 million Australian dollars. So it's not insignificant. We're going to talk about Transport for London. Now, Jonathan, I think you've got some first-hand experience of what went on with Transport for London. Is there something you can share with us about what the scenarios were with that?
Yeah, so Transport for London was a cyber attack rather than a botched upgrade. Exactly who was behind it, we're still not quite sure. Although a 17-year-old was arrested, allegedly someone in their bedroom having a bit of fun, but that has not yet been confirmed. It didn't stop the trains from running, but it stopped a lot of their other tech running. So, for example, there's a service whereby disabled people in London can use a service called Ring and Ride, which is an online service that was taken down, and many of the other tech systems were also taken down. As you said, Nick, it did cause disruption and it did cost them, and this is on the public record, 37 million pounds at the latest count. I think one of the interesting things here and again for other organizations to think about, is ultimately, and this was a data breach, by the way, as well. One of the interesting things here is about doing scenario planning ahead of time. So Transport for London, for example, was presented effectively with the decision: do we prioritize doing everything we can to keep data safe, or do we prioritize keeping some of those services running? But by keeping the services running, we leave the back door open for further data to be exfiltrated. So
Yeah.
scenario planning beforehand, thinking through, if we were the victim of an attack like this, what could happen? What might be some of the big decisions? And what would be our criteria or triggers or principles we should apply to make those decisions? Because in a live crisis, teams are under extraordinary pressure, time pressure. The stakes are high. We've heard about the costs, and making decisions that you haven't thought about beforehand under that amount of pressure isn't easy. So I'd just be counseling organizations to think about some of those big decisions you might need to make, get the key guys round the table
Yeah.
and walk it through beforehand so that you give yourself a better chance of making the best decision when the heat is on.
So Robert, in from your perspective, I mean, what went on here? I mean, from your perspective, I mean, Jonathan's outlined exactly what did happen, but I mean, there's some legal perspectives here as well, right?
I think, well, look, I mean, I can't comment too much on the UK law, but I think what was interesting for me is from a data breach perspective, this was quite small. I think it was maybe 5,000 people's accounts may have been accessed, so quite small in that terms. But in terms of the actual consequences, enormous, which I think is quite interesting. So small data breach didn't affect core services. Yet the consequences are enormous. And I think one of the interesting things I picked up from looking at this one is that one of the things that TfL did was they reset the password for 30,000 TfL staff. Every single person who worked for Transport for London had their password reset, and they had to turn up in person and validate their identity in order to get their password updated. So can you imagine that? That they had to get 30,000 people to locations within London to have their password reset, and that you would think, and this is probably something for Jonathan, you would think there has to be a better way. That in hindsight, having gone through that amount of pain and disruption, next time around there must be a better way of dealing with each member of staff and not having them to come in to personally to validate who they are in order to get their password reset. So I think, and as we mentioned at the top of this, £37 million in terms of the consequences to TfL. So I think it's not so much about the legal consequences. It's more about the preparation. It doesn't seem to we don't know a lot of the details. There's speculation this could be more of a social engineering thing rather than an exploitation of a vulnerability. And so I think it comes back to people, process, and technology. If this was a person who was fooled by some social engineering, some phishing, spear phishing, whatever it might be, it comes back to those basics. And then I think in terms of how TfL responded, I think with the benefit of hindsight, it's always 2020. An example like getting 30,000 people into various locations around London is probably not the best use of resources and time, and has probably led to a lot of that expense that TfL has suffered.
Couple of quick things to add to what Robert has just said. The thing about, if it were to happen again, surely there has to be a better way. Absolutely. And anybody that is involved in a cyber incident, you must do that lessons learned session, but don't just do the lessons learned session, then act on it, because the worst possible thing that an organization can do is then have a subsequent second incident. And you may well be a bigger target. If you've been a target once, it may be that people come back at you again. If you do make the same mistakes again, then you really are toast. So it's important to learn. The other thing I just wanted to endorse was what you said about, ultimately a relatively small incident. But again, this is about being self-aware as an organisation. The London Underground, Transport for London, is part of the very fabric of London life. So although the breach itself was small, it's a very, very well-known organisation that's within the fabric of London life. So it is going to be high profile. It's also part of critical national infrastructure. So the level of attention and scrutiny, despite the actual incident being small, is enormous. Reflect on your own organisation, understand how big a story and how big a target and how much scrutiny you would get if you were attacked, and plan accordingly.
Yeah, there's some big points here, aren't there? I mean, because the levels of preparedness are quite extraordinary when it comes down to these kind of incidents. I mean, small incident, fairly significant costs, but the inconvenience that went with it was quite substantial. Okay. Yeah, so moving into the last one then. So MediSecure, it's an Australian sort of organization as a government or a government oversight for prescriptions. Back I think it was November 2023, 12.9 million people had records attacked, breached. So, Robert, I think that it'd probably be a good idea to give us an overview from your perspective to begin with, if that's okay.
Yeah. So MediSecure, at the time of the cyber attack, they weren't actually part of this prescription delivery service. So the attack actually occurred in May, but when they were part of that particular service, I think it spanned 2019 to 2023. You mentioned 2023, and so they collected those 12.9 million records during that period, that 4-year period. And then they were no longer part of that particular government prescription service. And so this attack happened, 9 months later, something like that, around May 2024. And they discovered, or they were informed. I can't remember which one it was, but sometimes you actually get informed by the Australian Signals Directorate that you're under attack. So this is a database which was no longer active within this particular federal scheme. And yet these hackers have targeted it, and no surprise, 12.9 million records were available. And so once MediSecure realised that the breach was occurring, they worked with the Australian Signals Directorate. They actually reached out to the federal government and asked for financial assistance to help deal with the cost of dealing with this particular incident. The federal government turned them down, and unfortunately, they then went into liquidation. They didn't have enough cash flow to deal with the cost of responding to this incident and dealing with this breach of all of these records. So at that point, they stopped the investigation. So the liquidators took over. They stopped the investigation. So it makes it very difficult then for anyone to make, as an individual, to make a claim if you've suffered any loss or damage caused by that breach of that data, which would have ended up on the dark web. And it makes it very difficult for regulators to bring an action against a company in liquidation, which would you would expect to see in the ordinary course of events. But I think the key lesson to learn, or the key question is, what were they doing with 12.9 million records, vulnerable to attack, when they weren't actually part of an active government system? And it kind of brings into this question about, you really do need to be checking what data you hold. Why are you holding that data? Do you need to be holding onto that data still? Can it be encrypted? Can it be securely destroyed or anonymized? So you really need to be thinking about, this is a huge amount of data, and clearly, even if you're not actively involved in a particular service, you can still be a sitting target, because there's money to be had from these cyber attackers in this data.
Yeah, and this was quite sensitive data as well. I mean, like very
Yeah,
highly
it's health.
personal.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
really, really challenging.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I don't know. You had a quick look into this one
Mm,
yourself. I mean, this was a terrible thing. I mean, there was all sorts of information that was being made available on the dark web about people and what drugs they were taking and all sorts of stupid stuff. Really quite unpleasant for them to have to go
yeah.
through. So it was very emotional as well. Did you have a? I mean, how far did you go with this?
So I've got three thoughts on it, really. And I guess the first one probably is self evident to everyone these days, but don't think that the cyber criminals will ignore you because you are doing good things or you're involved in healthcare. Our National Health Service has been uh, brought to its knees with people not able to get prescriptions, appointments, operations. So don't for a minute think that the bad guys won't target you just because you're doing something important that actually lives may be at risk. You have to prepare anyway. The second thing I would say is that it's just a really powerful example of the impact that doing the wrong things before the crisis and then not being able to respond effectively to it, the impact it can have. So clearly, business and financial impact in the sense the organization no longer exists simply as a result of what happened. Operational impact at the time, people were not able to get the prescriptions that they needed and wanted. Reputational impact, before the organization went bust, its reputation was dragged over the coals. But most importantly, and you touched on it in your question, Nick, human impact. And we mustn't forget when we are planning and responding to cyber crises that often it's not, the tech that people really care about or should really care about. It's the people who are affected. And of course, there's the patients whose confidential data was leaked. It's also the innocent employees of MediSecure who've now lost their jobs as a result of a botched response. And I guess my third point is therefore that, cybersecurity and crisis management more broadly has to be viewed as a strategic issue, one that is not the job of the techies to do everything. It's one that requires the attention of the board, the leadership of the C-suite, because it is a strategic issue. It's not a technology issue.
Yeah, I've spoken to you about this before, and I mean, I've really been impressed by your perspective that it has to be a team game and it has to have, I mean, one leader but not the CEO, that kind of thing. It doesn't matter who it is. I mean, it could be the head of customers, it could be the head of operations, it could be the head of anything, but it's got to be somebody senior, not the CEO. But I mean, somebody that needs to be getting across this stuff. Yeah, I mean, am I paraphrasing correctly?
Yeah, and again, it's about it's about rehearsal, and there are many reasons why scenario-based exercise regularly enables you to perform better in crisis. But certainly, again, the angle you're going in there, Nick, it's really important that the various different parts of the organization that would be involved in responding to a cyber incident understand their roles and responsibilities and understand the roles and responsibilities of other parts of the organization. You want that response to be as integrated, coordinated, slick as possible. And if you haven't rehearsed it, I promise you it won't be any of those things.
Yeah. Robert, I mean, final word from you on this one.
Like I said, that the reminder is that uh, think about the data that you're holding, and think about what you should be doing with that. I mean, that's probably one of the key messages. Is again, it's a stunning amount of sensitive information that was being held, and you have to ask for what reason.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it comes back to this, to wrap everything up. I mean, it sounds to me as if, right, we are still talking about the same things as we were talking about, sort of 12, 18 months ago, except some scenarios have changed. It's people, process, technology. It's about understanding what technology you need to use in order to um, feel that you have done a competent job of protecting the data of your customers. It comes down to having a plan in place So that comes into staff training and things like that. So people, process, and having the right processes in place. So people, process, technology. If we wrap all of that up, then you've actually got something that actually means something. So you need some technical input, you need the people input, and you need the process input.
Yeah, I think when we look back at these, we picked these three events from 2024. We're trying to look forward to go, okay, what can we learn from these particular incidents, and what can we apply to our own organizations, and what can we do to stop these repeated patterns? Because we'll see similar incidents in 2025 and 2026. And so these incidents that we've talked about are good reminders of the sorts of things that can actually impact your organization, and whether that's a supplier related thing or a cyber attack. These incidents will keep occurring, and what can you do to be better prepared? And when you think about it from a legal point of view, you have to look at where's your liability exposure, where's your contract exposure, where's your governance, risk, and compliance exposure. How can I plug those gaps now, so that when the next CrowdStrike happens, I'm much better prepared, particularly from a legal point of view, and I'm sure Jonathan would echo that from a crisis management point of view.
Yeah, final wrap up from you, Jonathan.
Yeah, agreed. Prevention is always better than cure. So make sure you've assessed the risks and make sure that wherever possible you have mitigated them and prevented the attack from affecting you in the first place. But also know that no one is immune. No one is perfect. No one can prevent every attack. So you have to be ready to respond as well. And what you do in the first hour really, really matters. And if you botch it up in the first hour, or certainly in the first 24 hours, it's really hard to recover that ground. So stop it if you can, but be ready, right ready to respond if you can't.
Wise words of wisdom, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining Robert and I this evening. It's great to speak to you again, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Robert. That was Chat DPS, special edition, crisis management, with an overview. So thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to catching up with you next time around.